the eternal voice.
If the Midnight Library speaks to you, subscribe. Tonight, we open a book Lovecraft never finished, and let its absence finish us. There is a particular chill that doesn't come from gore or a gasp. It arrives as you hold a page and discover that the sentence stops, the ink thins, and beyond the last comma, there is only white. It is the chill of an unfinished tale. In the Lovecraftian cosmos, such gaps are not mistakes. They are doors, holes cut in paper that line up perfectly with holes in the sky. And when you tilt the sheet toward lamplight, you feel cold air moving through the gap like breath from another room. We call them the lost stories, but lost is not quite right. They were seen, touched, whispered into letters and notebooks. They went from mind to margin to attic box to auction catalog, changing hands like masks passed backstage in a theater thick with fog. Azathoth, which was never more than a paragraph and a plan, still tolls like a distant bell through twilight streets. The book, whose very title is a riddle folded into a ritual, waits with the weight of damp leather in your palms. The Descendant, a London gloom caught on a single breath, stains windows with soot and hereditary dread. The Very Old Folk, a dream in Latin transcribed as if by a scribe with frozen fingers, carries the iron smell of ancient massacres. The Evil Clergyman, seen while sleeping and recounted in a letter like a confession, places your hand on a drawer that should not be opened. The Thing in the Moonlight, a vision assembled by others from Lovecraft's loose fragments, approaches on rails through marshland, its driver grinning with wrong geometry. They are unfinished in one sense and overfinished in another, because incomplete horror invites completion, and the mind is the busiest of editors. You are that editor. The idea acts on you. The fragment is the key and the gate. The stakes are simple and they arrive early. When you take in a fragment, you are not just a reader, you are a participant. You hold the stage for a ghost to continue its monologue. You become part of the transmission. Knowledge has a cost, Lovecraft said, by never saying it outright. Once you know that there are unwritten pages, you begin to write them in the quiet tunnel behind your eyes. You fill the blank with stars. You draw a sign in the fog on the window. You finish the story, and the story finishes you. Consider the mechanics of this haunting. When you read At the Mountains of Madness, the narrative closes with a warning about what lies beyond the peaks. The ending is a wall, but when you encounter Azathoth as it exists, a single paragraph of bells and urban twilight, there is no wall. There is only a cliff edge where your imagination must either leap or fall. The complete story offers catharsis through resolution. The fragment offers something more dangerous, permanent engagement. It becomes a splinter in the mind's eye, working deeper with each remembering. The geography of these fragments is Providence, Rhode Island. In the 1920s and 1930s, picture the narrow streets where gas lamps still flickered against the encroaching electric age. The old colonial houses with their widows' walks and weathered shingles, the smell of salt air mixing with coal smoke. In one of these houses on Angel Street, a thin man in an old-fashioned collar sits at a writing desk as darkness gathers outside his window. His pen moves across paper in careful script, recording visions that arrived unbidden in dreams or waking reveries. Sometimes the vision dissolves like fog in sunlight, leaving only fragments, a face in a mirror, a book with wrong angles, a voice speaking in a dead language. These partial captures became the inheritance we now carry. They are not failed stories, but successful hauntings. They preserve the essential mystery by refusing to explain it away. They maintain the cosmic terror by never allowing it to become familiar. In the gap between the last written word and the white space that follows, something lives, something that watches, something that waits for you to lean close enough to hear its whisper. We will move carefully, then, like scholars with candles in a basement, where the chalk marks still smell of the hand that drew them. We will look at origins, Providence streets at dusk, the soft clatter of a typewriter under a second-story lamp, letters written in tight script that wander like a river in winter. We will watch how fragments traveled, editors, friends, inheritors, cultists of the printed word, the Arkham House machine binding darkness in cloth. We will name the mechanics of the gap, how the blank is an engine, how the half-told becomes a curse, how the veil and the void are the same garment held at two corners. But understand this from the beginning. By choosing to listen, you have already crossed a threshold. The fragments do not remain safely contained in their literary contexts. They leak, they spread, they find new hosts in every mind that encounters them and wonders what might have been written in those missing pages. You are now part of their transmission, a link in the chain that carries incomplete visions from one consciousness to another. The midnight library is open. The book waits. The curtain moves in a draft you cannot map, and behind it, something patient as starlight begins to stir. Before a tale dissolves at its edge, it must be born. Unfinishedness has an origin story, a table, a lamplight, a mind trained on old stones and the spaces between them. Picture the house on Angel Street, Providence, in the winter of 1921. Night air seeps through a cracked window, carrying the salt tang of Narragansett Bay and the distant clatter of trolley cars on wet cobblestone. The patter of rain on slate shingles creates a rhythm like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. On the desk, a cheap composition book with marbled covers, a bottle of Waterman's ink gone thick in the cold, and a page of ruled paper with a title at the top that is more fate than plan. The lamplight flickers, casting shadows that seem to move independently of their sources, and in this uncertain illumination, Howard Phillips Lovecraft begins to catalog doors that lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Lovecraft was a maker of complete architectures, yes, the cyclopean geometries of Relia, the blasphemous angles of the witch house, the star-spawned cities rising from Antarctic ice. But he was also a cataloger of thresholds, a keeper of keys that opened onto voids. His commonplace book, that leather-bound index of sparks, lists story germs like a meteor shower frozen in ink. Man lives near graveyard. How does he live and what happens? Horrible secret and crypt of old church. Dreams of cities and lands beyond the stars. Each entry is a seed waiting for soil, a door waiting for someone to turn the handle. Some would bloom into full tales. Others would remain forever poised on the edge of becoming, their incompleteness a feature rather than a flaw. The early 1920s were a hinge in Lovecraft's creative evolution. He was shifting from the jeweled dreamscapes of Lord Dunsany toward the cold geometries that would define cosmic horror. In this transitional period, fragments emerged not from failure but from the tension between vision and form. Consider Azathoth, originally conceived as a novel whose very title strikes like a gong in the void. What survives on paper is a single opening paragraph, a man walking through a city at dusk, the bells of a steeple calling as if from another century, the sense of barriers thinned by music and industrial soot. The rest exists only as scattered references in letters, notes penciled in margins, a momentum that aimed toward the blind idiot god piping at the center of chaos. He planned a long work that would trace the narrator's journey from urban twilight into cosmic revelation, but time, money, and perhaps a shifting aesthetic sensibility drew the curtain early. Yet that solitary paragraph did not fail in its incompleteness. It became something more potent than a finished novel might have been, a lure that pointed toward the dream quest of unknown Kadath, toward the revolutionary idea that music could serve as a gateway between dimensions, that sleep was a palace with 1,000 locked doors, and each dream a different key. The book rises from the same creative mist. The title itself is both object and sentence, noun and command. It begins with the narrator acquiring a volume, always a dangerous act in Lovecraft's universe, with the ceremonial weight of a ritual performed without full understanding of its consequences. There is the immediate sensory anchor, the smell of mold rising from pages that feel damp to the touch, a cellar's chill seeping through floorboards, a cemetery wall felt in the fingertips like braille written by the dead. The ritual that follows is half described, the oath half spoken, leaving gaps, where the reader's imagination must supply the missing words. Here, too, the fragment ends on a ledge, its last line pointing into darkness that scholars have since traced into the festival and the wider mythology of the Necronomicon. Lovecraft had discovered the theater of pages as portals, and through these early experiments he was teaching his audience to recognize certain props on sight. A book whose letters shift when viewed peripherally, a sign whose curves suggest claws, a mask that seems to breathe with its own life. The incomplete ritual in the book established a template that would echo through decades of cosmic horror, the sense that some knowledge is too dangerous to complete, too alien to fully comprehend. The Descendant emerges from London fog, a fragment of profound aristocratic decay set against the city's crumbling grandeur. It speaks of a narrator whose lineage is as long and shadowed as the city's history, haunted by ancestral secrets and drawn to ancient, forgotten things beneath the streets. He delves into old texts seeking answers to a gnawing dread and finds himself pulled toward subterranean passages, toward whispers of things that predate human civilization, the sense of inherited doom, of knowledge that corrodes the soul, permeates every line. The story's incompletion leaves the ultimate revelation to fester in the reader's mind, a subtle poison that works long after the page ends. His dreams served as workshops where visions arrived with too much complexity to be easily tamed by narrative structure. In letters to friends like R.H. Barlow and Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft testifies to nocturnal revelations that outran his ability to capture them in conventional story form. He wrote swiftly when inspiration flowed like water through a broken dam, but when practical concerns intervened, chronic ill health, persistent financial struggles, the demands of magazine submission schedules, he would set projects aside like masks carefully replaced on a shelf while fog drifted through the theater. There is a cultural origin to this productive incompleteness as well. Arthur Machen's The Great Godpan had taught him the terrible power of the unsaid, the way suggestion could accomplish what explicit description would destroy. Edgar Allan Poe had provided the machinery of atmosphere, the understanding that mood was more important than plot. Lord Dunsany had offered towers glimpsed in sleep, entire worlds that existed fully only in the spaces between words. And science itself, astronomy's crushing distances, geology's deep time, anthropology's evidence of pre-human civilizations, had tossed him a rope into an abyss of possibility. In such a ferment of influences and inspirations, to finish every story might have been to betray its essential mystery. To leave certain tales unsealed was to keep faith with the unknowable, to honor the cosmic principle that some doors should remain forever ajar, admitting just enough light to reveal the darkness beyond. The fragments do not emerge from failure but from a deeper understanding that in a universe too vast for human comprehension, the most honest art might be the art that knows when to stop, when to let the void speak in its own voice of stars and silence. A fragment is not only what is left of a story, it is also what a story becomes when it enters the market of caretakers. The stagehand steps into the light. The curtain moves, and suddenly the audience realizes they have been watching not just a performance, but the machinery that makes performance possible. Lovecraft died in March 1937, leaving behind not a grand mausoleum of completed works, but a work table in perpetual disarray, manuscripts in varying states of completion, letters brimming with half-remembered dreams, marginal notes scrawled in fading ink, and those troubling pages whose last lines pointed into darkness like compasses, spinning toward magnetic poles that existed only in sleep. The room on Angel Street held the detritus of a mind that had spent decades mapping territories that existed in the spaces between waking and nightmare. His friends stepped forward, not merely as mourners gathering flowers, but as stewards and interpreters of a legacy that seemed to resist easy preservation. August Derleth and Donald Wandre recognized that something unprecedented had died with their correspondent, not just a writer, but an entire cosmology held together by one man's vision of cosmic indifference. In 1939, they formed Arkham House Publishers with the explicit mission of binding the ephemeral into cloth, of giving physical form to dreams that might otherwise dissolve like morning mist. Their first volume, The Outsider and Others, appeared that same year, followed by Beyond the Wall of Sleep in 1943, then a steady procession of collections that would transform Lovecraft's scattered remains into something approaching liturgy for a growing congregation of cosmic horror devotees. In these meticulously bound volumes, the fragments were not hidden away like embarrassing family secrets. They were gathered, labeled, occasionally lacquered with editorial commentary that treated them as precious curios displayed in a literary vitrine. Azathoth, the Book, and The Descendant appeared alongside completed stories, their incompleteness presented as a feature rather than a flaw. Essays and personal letters began to be read as proto-stories, their casual observations elevated to the status of formal literature. Dreams became drafts, and drafts became gospel. The very Old Folk exemplifies this editorial alchemy. Originally embedded in a 1927 letter to R.H. Barlow, it narrates a Roman officer's report of an ancient massacre in the Iberian hills. The prose riddled with Latin phrases and an atmosphere of mounting dread that seeps through the paper like groundwater. When Derleth and Wandre extracted this passage from its epistolary context and printed it as a story proper, they were performing a kind of literary archaeology, excavating narrative gold from the matrix of personal correspondence. The Evil Clergyman underwent a similar transformation. Originally written as a dream account for Barlow, it places the reader in a shabby lodging house room with a writing desk, a strange electrical device that hums with malevolent purpose, and the presence of a thin-faced man in stained clerical clothing whose humanity seems increasingly questionable. The dream's inherent immediacy translates perfectly to the printed page, where it functions as complete horror despite its origins as casual dream-sharing between friends. The Thing in the Moonlight represents the most audacious editorial transformation, a phantom of attribution that demonstrates how hunger and paper can conjure stories from the thinnest material. J. Chapman Misk assembled it from fragments of a Lovecraft letter describing a nightmare, a man trapped on marshy railway tracks, pursued by something that might be a train but moves with wrong rhythms, driven by a grinning figure whose eyes are positioned incorrectly. As printed, it takes on the undeniable shape of a complete short story. Was it intended as literature by its original dreamer? Certainly not. Did it become literature through the editorial process? Absolutely, by an alchemy that transforms base materials into narrative gold. The mask of authorship slid smoothly onto the mask of dream. But editors do more than preserve and present. They also shape, interpret, and sometimes invent. Derleth moved beyond the role of caretaker to become something approaching a collaborator with the dead. The Lurker at the Threshold, published in 1945, presented itself as a novel by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth, constructed from fragmentary notes but bearing Derleth's unmistakable stamp. Later, The Watchers Out of Time offered an entire suite of posthumous collaborations, stories that claimed Lovecraftian parentage but reflected Derleth's more conventional, supernatural sensibilities. The scholarly verdict has hardened over decades. These are primarily Derleth's compositions draped in Lovecraftian imagery, steering cosmic indifferentism toward a more manageable quasi-theological conflict between benevolent elder gods and malevolent old ones. Derleth's cosmological map bears little resemblance to Lovecraft's vision of an indifferent universe, but it mattered enormously because maps, once drawn, tend to endure long after their accuracy has been questioned. Against this tide of completion stood a counter-movement of scholarly precision. S. T. Joshi and David E. Schultz, patient as conservators in damp archives, collated manuscripts, weighed variants, and peeled away the lacquer of well-meaning edits. They restored texts to the grain of Lovecraft's own diction where possible, footnoted provenance like cartographers marking shoals, and taught readers to hear the difference between Providence fog and editorial smoke. The transmission proved that interpretation is never neutral. Lynn Carter created elaborate Zothic cycles from offhand mentions. Ramsey Campbell filled English landscapes with Lovecraftian resonance based on tonal cues rather than explicit mythology. Brian Lumley moved boldly into tentacular epics that spoke an entirely different dialect of cosmic horror. Each became a link in a chain of transmission that stretched the original fragments in new directions, like light passing through a prism and emerging as a spectrum of possibilities. Two complementary cults emerged from this process, one that hungered for completion and closure, seeking to fill every gap and answer every question raised by the fragments, another that venerated the veil itself, understanding that some mysteries grew more powerful when left unsolved. The tension between these approaches would define Lovecraftian scholarship for generations, creating a perpetual dialogue between those who wanted to build comprehensive mythologies and those who recognized that true horror lay in the spaces between certainties. You now stand at the intersection of these impulses, holding both the completed completions and the jagged originals. The fragments have learned to travel, to wear new masks, to speak in editorial voices, to multiply in photocopiers and scanners. They survived because hands lifted them, because eyes loved them, because the stagehand dared the light. But to understand their true power, you must lean closer to the mechanism itself, to the way incompletion colonizes memory, how a half-told ritual continues without you, how the gap becomes an engine that runs on your attention. If the fragment is a door, let us ask how it opens, not with hinges and a knob, but by a principle embedded in you that cannot resist making a whole from a part. The horror is not in what the fragment shows, but in the completion your mind supplies, and cannot stop supplying, even when you recognize the trap closing around your attention. Cognitive science provides clinical names for this compulsion, closure, the hunger for sealed forms that drives you to connect dots, even when no line should exist. Apophenia, the pattern-seeking that finds faces in wallpaper and conspiracies in coincidence. The gestalt drive that cannot abide broken circles. And the Zeigarnik effect, by which unfinished tasks persist in memory like bells that continue ringing long after the rope has been released. Lovecraft knew none of these terms, yet he understood their function with the precision of a watchmaker who has never studied metallurgy, but knows exactly which spring will hold the most tension. He weaponized omission. He gave you just enough to feel the shape moving in the fog, the outline of a ritual, the echo of a name, the weight of a book in your hands, and no more. In such deliberately constructed spaces, the idea ceases to be passive content and becomes an active agent. You move from audience to stage, to engine. Consider the basic unit of cosmic dread, vastness that cannot be shown whole because the human mind lacks the architecture to contain infinity. It must be implied through fragments, suggested through the spaces between known things. Therefore, the cosmos itself uses ellipses as its fundamental grammar. Stars are pinpricks of light. The meaningful content lies in the black between them, in the void that gives context to illumination. In literature, the white space between paragraphs becomes a similar void, where thought dives and discovers depths that were never explicitly written. An unfinished tale is a grander ellipse, engineered to create what we might call a lifelong Zeigarnik effect. You carry it like a splinter that works deeper with each remembering. Mechanically, here is precisely what happens when you encounter a Lovecraft fragment. The text offers you a schema carefully constructed like ritual choreography, a mood that settles over consciousness like fog rolling through cemetery gates, a setting that feels simultaneously familiar and wrong, a talisman that serves as a focal point for dread, a book bound in leather that feels damp to the touch, a mask with eye holes that seem to track movement, a device on a desk that hums with purposes you cannot name. Then comes the sign, a sigil carved into a door that should not exist, a whisper carried by water that flows uphill, the scent of something burning in a room where no fire burns. Finally, a vector, the downward stair that descends farther than the building should allow, the steeple bell that rings at hours when no one pulls the rope, the moonlit path that leads toward a horizon that seems both infinitely distant and uncomfortably close. Then the fragment stops. You feel the narrative curve rising toward revelation, toward the moment when all elements would converge into meaning, and then nothing. White space, the end of ink. Your brain, a relentless predictive machine, immediately begins generating plausible continuations based on stories you have absorbed and fears you carry in the spaces between conscious thoughts. But in cosmic horror, the referent, the thing the story points toward, remains fundamentally unknown. Your mental continuations therefore stay spectral, refusing to collapse into any single image or explanation. The dread remains fog, omnipossible, never pinned down, never resolved into the comfortable certainty of a monster you can name and therefore defeat. There is also a metaphysical dimension that aligns with Lovecraft's central philosophical proposition. The universe is not about us. It operates according to principles that predate human consciousness and will continue long after our species has dissolved into cosmic dust. In such a cosmos, narrative endings are human consolations, artificial constructs we impose on processes that recognize no such boundaries. A complete story arc implies that meaning is available to human understanding, that the world can be domesticated through narrative structure. Incomplete arcs reflect a more alien truth. The processes we witness do not end where we need them to end for psychological comfort. A ritual begins under a mask in some basement ceremony and continues its work whether or not the witness faints, whether or not the story concludes, whether or not you close the book and turn off the lamp. Hold a physical object to understand this principle more clearly. A mask, plain and white, with two eye holes cut into its surface. The human face appears through absence, two empty ovals where gaze should emerge. The mask achieves its uncanny completeness precisely because the missing parts map onto your expectation of what a face should contain. Your mind supplies the eyes behind the holes, the breath that would fog the inner surface, the intelligence that would direct the gaze. A Lovecraft fragment functions as such a mask. but with the mouth also missing. It demands your voice to complete its expression. You speak through it, supplying the words that were never written, the conclusions that were never reached. But in doing so, you must ask, who is actually speaking? Are you completing the fragment, or is the fragment completing itself through you? The mechanism operates on multiple levels simultaneously, creating what we might call a hierarchy of gaps. Psychologically, it exploits pattern-seeking compulsions that evolved to help us survive by recognizing threats in incomplete information. Aesthetically, it transforms absence into the most eloquent form of presence. Philosophically, it embodies the cosmic horror principle that some truths are too vast or alien for complete human comprehension. The fragment becomes a trap that catches consciousness, a lens that focuses attention on the spaces where meaning should be, but isn't quite there yet. This is why these fragments persist, while many complete stories fade from memory like morning mist. They establish residence in consciousness, creating gaps that the mind cannot help but revisit. Each return deepens the mystery rather than solving it, because the mechanism is designed not to provide answers, but to sustain questions. The fragment acts on you by making you complicit in its continuation. You become both reader and writer, both observer and observed, both the key and the gate through which the unfinished story continues its patient work. In recognizing this mechanism, you do not escape it. Recognition becomes another layer of the trap, another way the fragment demonstrates its power over the architecture of attention. You now carry not just the original gaps, but awareness of how gaps function, which creates a meta-gap that operates according to the same principles. The bell tolls in the distance, the water drips in stone corridors, the candle flame leans toward a draft you cannot map, and you lean forward, despite knowing better, to hear what the silence has to say. Let us open the cabinet and lift 3 masks, one by one. Feel their weight in your palms, the way the plaster has been shaped by hands that understood the architecture of dread. Feel where the material stops and the void begins. Notice how your own skin shows through the eye holes, how your breath fogs the inner surface, how wearing them changes not just what you see, but how you see. Azathoth presents itself as a single paragraph, yet it contains a metropolis of tone and implication. A man walks at dusk through a city whose clock towers and soot-stained bricks exist as much in memory as in matter, where the industrial present cannot quite obscure the colonial past that haunts every cobblestone. The bells of distant steeples ring faintly, their sound traveling through air thick as damp wool, carrying echoes of centuries that refuse to stay buried. Somewhere in this twilight landscape stands a little garret where music is being composed. Not mere melody, but music that functions as cartography, each note a coordinate in a map that leads toward territories no human geography has ever charted. What Lovecraft planned beyond this atmospheric opening exists only in scattered references, in concepts that never crystallized into plot. The center of all things is Azathoth, the blind idiot god whose nuclear chaos spawns and devours realities like a cosmic engine that runs on madness itself. Around this central absence, all existence dances to the rhythm of flute and drum, an eternal ceremony that predates consciousness and will outlast meaning. The fragment does not attempt to reach this throne of ultimate chaos. It possesses the wisdom to understand that such a journey would destroy both narrator and narrative. Instead, it shows us only the corridor that leads toward revelation and tells us what waits at its end by naming a name that functions like a curse, a sound that, once heard, begins its work of transformation in the listener's mind. The device here operates through urban twilight, that liminal hour when familiar streets become stages for impossible encounters. when the sense of the past pressing through the present creates gaps where other realities might bleed through. The book literalizes the talisman that appears throughout Lovecraft's work, making concrete the abstract horror of forbidden knowledge. Here the narrator acquires a volume whose very physicality announces its wrongness, a cover that feels perpetually damp despite the dry air, pages that smell like an opened crypt, binding that seems to pulse with its own circulation. He performs, or perhaps is performed upon by, a rite whose details remain deliberately obscured, words spoken in languages that predate human speech, signs traced with fingers that move as if guided by intelligence not entirely his own. The geography shifts as the ritual progresses. There is a wall, perhaps belonging to a cemetery, perhaps descending into a cellar that extends deeper than any building should allow. The narrator climbs, then looks down into a pit, filled not with darkness but with air that possesses the density and pressure of water. The sensory details accumulate like sediment, the texture of stone worn smooth by countless hands, the echo of footsteps in spaces that seem to expand with each sound, the weight of attention from presences that observe without revealing themselves. We can almost see the mask this fragment wears, smooth as funeral marble, solemn as a burial shroud, bearing no resemblance to carnival grotesquerie, but instead embodying the quiet horror of ceremonial death. The fragment stops precisely where agency flips, where the reader realizes they are no longer the master of the ritual but have become its instrument. The book's genetic material migrates through Lovecraft's later work, appearing in The Festival as the Necronomicon, in the forbidden stacks of Miskatonic University's library, in the entire industry of fake grimoires that followed. Each appearance carries the original fragment's understanding that some books read their readers. The descendant shifts into an entirely different register, embodying the London ruin that fascinated Lovecraft, despite his never having visited that city. Here we encounter the hereditary scholar whose bloodline has been thinned by generations of forbidden knowledge, like wine cut with water until only the faintest trace of the original vintage remains. We sit with him in a gray room above a gray street, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of a lifetime spent pursuing answers that corrode the soul. He speaks in a voice that grows weaker as it circles closer to its central dread, telling of older stones that lie beneath London's foundations, of Roman culverts where explorers once crawled and discovered not the expected archaeology but something that feels like a smell left by the future in the past. His monologue reveals that he has encountered the Necronomicon directly, and more troubling still, that the book has encountered him in return, leaving marks that no amount of scholarly distance can erase. The fragment's power lies in its use of voice as the primary vehicle for horror. This is a monologue that weakens as it progresses, a mind fraying at the edges as it attempts to articulate experiences that language was never designed to contain. The absence of any conventional ending becomes itself a diagnosis. There is no resolution because there is no cure for the kind of knowledge that has infected the speaker. There is a unifying principle that runs through all three fragments. Each makes you hear something that exists beyond the boundaries of the text. Bells tolling through fog that seems to muffle and amplify simultaneously. Words spoken in alphabets that died with civilizations whose names have been forgotten by history. A voice speaking in a chill room where shadows gather like an audience for a performance that should never have begun. Sound serves as the perfect vector for incompletion because it cannot be directly represented on the page. It can only be evoked through description, and then your memory and imagination must produce the actual auditory experience. How does one draw the sound of a bell? You cannot. You can only describe its effects, its contexts, its implications, and trust that the reader's mind will supply the missing sensory data. In your room, even now, you can hear that distant bell tolling through fog, though no such bell exists in your immediate environment. That phantom sound is the mechanism at work, the fragment extending its influence beyond the boundaries of the page, into the architecture of your attention. Dreams are stages without carpenters, theaters where props appear because the narrative demands them, and actors speak as if remembering lines from a script, written in water that dissolves even as the words are spoken. The architecture obeys no earthly physics. Corridors lead both deeper underground and higher into impossible towers. Walls press close while extending infinitely upward, and time moves like honey poured through a sieve. When such stages abandon their nocturnal theaters and seek permanence in print, they bring their fog with them, that peculiar atmosphere of half-remembered significance that clings to dream logic like moisture to stone. 3 such fogs await our examination, each demonstrating how the veil and the void collaborate in the architecture of incompletion. The Very Old Folk presents Lovecraft channeling history through a trance state that feels both deeply personal and archaeologically precise. Embedded within a 1927 letter to R.H. Barlow, he recounts a dream in which his consciousness inhabits a Roman officer stationed in the Iberian Peninsula, reading military reports about a detachment that vanished while investigating disturbances in the mountainous regions. The tone achieves an archaic quality, deliberately sprinkled with Latin phrases that serve as anchors, creating the illusion that this dream narrative possesses historical credibility. The body of the imagined report speaks with bureaucratic precision about encounters with a tribe described as older than all known tribes, dwelling in tunnel systems that branch through the earth, like arteries and veins in some vast subterranean organism. No creature ever appears directly on this dream stage. Instead, we encounter only aftermath, the lingering stink of an abandoned military camp, where tent flaps move in wind that carries the scent of iron and old leather, the impression of footprints pressed into earth that suggest neither human feet nor recognizable animal paws, but something that partakes of both categories while belonging fully to neither. The fragment stops, as dreams invariably do, on a hanging note with the sense of a vast pattern glimpsed but never quite learned. The power of this piece lies entirely in its documentary aura, the uncanny sensation that you have encountered not fictional narrative but recovered dossier. The scholarly voice functions as incantation, recruiting your respect for historical documents and turning that respect against you, making you complicit in accepting impossible testimony simply because it arrives wrapped in familiar academic authority. The evil clergyman emerged from a different kind of nocturnal transmission, written directly to Barlow as an account of a dream that possessed unusual clarity and persistence. The narrative achieves immediate intimacy by placing you not as observer but as inhabitant of the dream space, a shabby room furnished with a writing desk, whose drawers seem to contain more than their physical dimensions should allow. Upon this desk sits a device that defies easy categorization, a box equipped with wires that emit a barely audible humming, suggesting electrical current but also something more organic, more alive. The air tastes of dust and ozone, thick with the weight of accumulated secrets. The central figure appears as a thin-faced man wearing a threadbare clerical collar, but his movements gradually reveal that his relationship to humanity remains approximate at best. There is a warning delivered with casual authority. A certain drawer must not be opened under any circumstances. This prohibition arrives at the precise moment when your hand, not the narrator's hand, but yours, begins moving toward the forbidden handle. The effect creates a collapse of narrative distance that few literary techniques can achieve. You are not told about events, you are placed within them, made complicit in the violation that follows. The ending implies transformation of the most fundamental kind, identity sliding like water through fingers, the face in the mirror refusing to resolve into the familiar features you expect to see reflected there. The second-person immediacy becomes a hand on your wrist, guiding you toward the drawer that should remain sealed, but never does. The thing in the moonlight represents the most complex case in this trinity, existing as what we might call an editorial revenant, a story that died and was resurrected through others' ministrations. The original source consists of Lovecraft's description, contained within a letter, of a dream featuring a man trapped on railway tracks that traverse a lunar marsh where the ground possesses the consistency of a soaked sponge. Each step makes a sound like breath through wet cloth. A light approaches through this impossible landscape, but its quality announces itself as fundamentally wrong, carried by a vehicle that can only be called a vehicle because language offers no better term. The driver grins with geometry that violates the basic architecture of human faces, sporting eyes positioned in locations that create a parody of familiar features. When J. Chapman Misk assembled these scattered elements into what appears as a complete short story, he created a curious literary machine, cleanly shaped yet bearing visible seams that reveal its composite nature. Those seams become part of the text's uncanny power rather than flaws to be concealed. The story reminds you constantly that texts are masks worn over other texts, that authorship itself can become a kind of haunting. The aura of textual inauthenticity functions as its ghost. It announces that it might not represent authentic Lovecraft, then observes as your dread increases, because effectiveness proves that authorial authenticity matters less than the mechanism's ability to colonize consciousness. Compare their mechanics, and you discover three distinct strategies for transforming nocturnal vision into literary effect. The very old folk employs scholarly voice as spell, recruiting your reverence for documents against you. The evil clergyman uses second-person immediacy as weapon, collapsing distance until you discover your own hand reaching for forbidden knowledge. The thing in the moonlight makes editorial construction visible, using inauthenticity as specter that haunts the reading experience. Three approaches, one result. The idea acts on you while you watch, and you become both key and gate for dreams that refuse to end when the page turns white. We are at the altar of the unsaid. The liturgy is minimal, stripped to its essential gestures. The priest wears no mask because there is no face to hide, or perhaps because the absence of a face is itself the most terrifying mask of all. The stage is empty, and that emptiness has been arranged with the precision of a master architect who understands that void can be more expressive than substance, that silence can speak louder than any chorus of voices raised in song or terror. Apophasis represents the ancient religious practice of speaking by not speaking, of naming the divine by systematically refusing all names. God is not this, not that, not the other thing. A process of elimination that builds an architecture of awe by carving away everything that can be positively identified, leaving only the negative space where mystery dwells. Lovecraft's cosmos operates according to no theological belief system, yet structurally it kneels before this same principle. He shows what cannot be shown by cutting away what could have been shown. He reveals the unknowable by demonstrating the limits of the knowable. He denies conventional endings and supplies something more lasting than resolution, a dread that persists precisely because it has been given no definitive shape to dissolve into familiarity. We can place this practice beside Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous philosophical boundary, Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That stark line has become a folkword in intellectual discourse, invoked to bar idle chatter from approaching territories that demand reverence through silence. Lovecraft performs a paradoxical transformation of this principle. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof let us whisper, creating a literary mode that uses silence itself as material, like a sculptor who works primarily with negative space. The whisper in his fragments is never content in the conventional sense. It is contour, the suggestion of shapes moving through fog, the sound of footsteps on a stage we cannot see but know to be occupied by presences that watch our attempts to listen. Cosmic horror functions as a refusal of anthropocentrism, certainly, but it also operates as a discipline of the unsaid that requires as much precision as any positive statement. It resists tidy closure not from laziness or narrative incompetence, but because closure implies jurisdiction over meaning. It declares that the court of human understanding has authority over cosmic processes. The universe revealed by modern science operates as a fundamentally foreign jurisdiction where human categories hold no special privilege. The most powerful moments in Lovecraft's work often occur exactly where his notorious descriptive appetite fails, where his tendency to pile adjective upon adjective suddenly breaks down, and a blank opens in the text like a gap in ice that reveals black water beneath. Silence in these fragments possesses distinct subtypes, each operating according to different principles and serving different functions in the architecture of dread. Factual silence emerges when information simply stops. We never learn what the Roman detachment encountered in those Iberian tunnels because the report breaks off mid-sentence, leaving only the impression of hoofbeats fading into distance and the lingering scent of iron and old leather. The letter stops, and the details remain forever out of reach, not because they were lost, but because they were never meant to be fully recorded. Procedural silence occurs when a ritual or process is described halfway and then deliberately withheld. We see the book opened, the words begun, the signs traced in the air with fingers that move as if guided by intelligence not entirely human, but the completion happens in a space the text refuses to illuminate. The ritual continues beyond the page break, in territories where your imagination must supply the missing gestures and incantations. Ontological silence surrounds entities like Azathoth, whose nature as the center of all chaos cannot be perceived directly without dissolving the perceiver. The narrative can only approach from the periphery, describing effects while leaving the cause shrouded, acknowledging that some truths are too vast or alien for direct representation. The name itself becomes an incantation, pointing toward unnamability. Ethical silence manifests when the fragment refuses to provide moral comfort or resolution. We are never told that the descendant found redemption, never assured that the evil clergyman received appropriate punishment, never given the consolation of justice restored. The universe and its stories remain indifferent to human notions of morality or narrative satisfaction. In psychology, the unsaid functions as a hook that catches in memory and refuses to release its grip. The Zygarnik effect ensures that the curtain keeps fluttering long after the play has supposedly ended, because unfinished business possesses a peculiar persistence that completed tasks cannot match. In philosophy, apophatic method serves to humble the mind by demonstrating the limits of positive knowledge. In theater, an empty stage makes the audience lean forward with anticipation rather than settling back in satisfaction. Even in our contemporary digital culture, a redacted document generates more engagement than a transparent one, because the hidden portion becomes more intriguing than any revelation could be. The unsaid proves sticky in ways that the completely articulated cannot achieve. This brings us to a paradox pair essential to understanding how these fragments operate: the dynamic tension between veil and void. The veil implies that something substantial exists behind it, waiting to be revealed if only we could find the right angle or sufficient courage to pull the fabric aside. The void suggests that there may be nothing at all behind the covering, that the mystery consists precisely in the absence of any mystery to be solved. Lovecraft's genius lies in holding these contradictory possibilities together without resolving them into comfortable certainty. His fragments function simultaneously as veils over voids, and as voids that masquerade as veils. We cannot help but expect meaningful content behind each page break, even when we suspect that the content might consist entirely of cosmic indifference. The trick, and it is a profound one, lies in recognizing that our expectation itself becomes the content. Your leaning forward in anticipation becomes the engine of dread. Your hunger for completion becomes the mechanism that sustains the fragment's power over consciousness. Even the proper names that populate the mythos participate in this apophatic method. Critics sometimes dismiss them as mere name-dropping, but these appellations function as incantations rather than descriptions. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep. These are not characters in a conventional sense, but principles, structural forces, cosmic equations that hint at an architecture of terror fundamentally beyond human comprehension. Their power emerges from what they imply, what they refuse to define, what they leave eternally unsaid. They are masks without faces, doors that open onto carefully arranged emptiness. Contemporary digital culture has adopted this apophatic toolkit with remarkable sophistication. Lost media, corrupted files, redacted documents, truncated feeds, these become the new veils. A progress bar that stops at 99% generates more anxiety than one that completes smoothly. Analog horror channels use static and distortion not as technical failures but as deliberate gaps where the viewer's mind must supply the missing information. The algorithm itself rewards the cliff over the landing, the question over the answer, the fragment over the whole. This philosophical framework helps explain why attempts to complete Lovecraft's fragments often diminish rather than enhance their effectiveness. The completion violates the apophatic principle by providing positive content where negative space was performing more sophisticated work. The fragment succeeds not despite its incompleteness, but because of it, because it has learned to speak the language of silence, fluently enough to make that silence more eloquent than any words could be. In this theater of omission, the empty stage becomes the most crowded space imaginable, populated by all the possibilities that positive statement would eliminate. The unsaid speaks, and we lean forward to hear what it whispers about territories that exist beyond the boundaries of what can be safely named. The curtain moves in a draft that comes from somewhere beyond the theater itself, and you feel that movement as a promise. There are more masks waiting, more stages prepared, more silences arranged with the precision of a master craftsman who understands that the most powerful horror lies not in what is revealed, but in the spaces between revelation where your own voice must complete the incantation. The theater moved platforms, abandoning its velvet seats and gas-lit stages for the infinite auditorium of screens. The curtain has become a progress bar that loads with agonizing slowness, promising completion while delivering only the next buffer. The stage now exists as a timeline that scrolls endlessly downward, each post a new scene in a drama that refuses conventional acts. The audience finds itself perpetually on stage, performing reactions in real time through comments and shares, while the masks have transformed into thumbnails, faces cropped at the eyes, mouths frozen mid-syllable, each promising revelation that hovers forever on articulation's edge but never completes. The fundamental mechanics persist, they thrive. Lost media culture represents the contemporary cult of fragments, a decentralized religion whose adherents worship at absence's altar. The liturgical phrases retain their incantatory power: banned episode, missing reel, broadcast once, tape recovered from estate sale. Each functions as a spell summoning collective attention toward cultural gaps. We construct entire channels dedicated to chasing blank minutes, pursuing deleted scenes with archaeological fervor. The practice employs precisely the hooks that animate the very old folk. Documentary aura transforming speculation into scholarship. Redaction's power to make absence more compelling than presence. The irresistible claim of recovered artifacts carrying forbidden knowledge's weight. Some examples reveal themselves as elaborate hoaxes that evolve into genuine folklore. Others represent authentic gaps that collective attention mythologizes into significance far exceeding their original context. In every case, the unsaid functions as bait, drawing consciousness toward territories where imagination must supply what documentation cannot provide. Analog horror emerges as perhaps the most sophisticated, contemporary application of Lovecraftian fragment mechanics, borrowing directly from dream logic governing pieces like The Thing in the Moonlight. These productions, liminal corridors extending beyond architectural possibility, VHS tapes buzzing with electromagnetic interference, emergency broadcasts corrupted by too many anomalies. Understand that the seam itself serves as ghost. You notice the tape glitch precisely where faces should appear, compression obscuring crucial details, audio dropout swallowing important words. Viewing becomes archaeological. You pause, scrub through frames, write comments contributing additional lore to collaborative mythology. Creators deliberately never fill all blanks because blanks themselves maintain engagement. Your mind supplies monsters lurking behind doors, populating empty corridors with threats wearing your fear's masks. The backrooms phenomenon exemplifies this principle. A single photograph of carpeted office labyrinth illuminated by fluorescence becomes a stage populated entirely by viewer imagination. The original offers no actors, narrative, or resolution. Instead, it provides architectural framework viewers fill with movement, danger, rules emerging through collective elaboration. Alternate reality games formalize this compulsion into interactive entertainment, transforming audiences from passive consumers into active collaborators. Clues planted across platforms, hidden in descriptions, embedded in code, distributed through live events, create narratives that unspool only when audiences act. Players become co-authors like readers completing Lovecraft's fragments, their sleep adjusting to drops and decodes cadence. Successful ARGs never fully resolve. They hang endings on hooks, letting them swing indefinitely. Energy lies in pursuit rather than capture. The cost measures in time, sleep, and gradual erosion of investigation conspiracy boundaries. The forbidden drawer's ritual repeats. Do not open, do not click, do not dig deeper. Yet hands move toward mice. Fingers hover over links, minds lean into gaps. Even mainstream franchises leverage incompletion as retention strategy. Pop cultural universes deliberately sprinkle unanswered mysteries throughout narratives to sustain engagement between releases. Commentary channels farm unsolved puzzles, stretching ambiguous scenes into speculation hours. Constant sequelization ensures nothing truly concludes. Every ending becomes setup, every resolution opens questions. Cosmic horror's structural closure refusal transforms into economic strategy where algorithms function as elder entities, rewarding half-answers with increased visibility, feeding on engagement metrics spiking highest when audiences lean forward in frustration rather than settling back satisfied. Yet crucial differences deserve preservation. Lovecraft's fragments emerged from honest intersections of human limitation and cosmic theme. Incomplete because completion would betray essential nature, not serve marketing strategies. When contemporary creators mimic techniques purely for engagement metrics, results often feel cynical, manipulative, hollow. Form remains but substance evaporates, leaving mechanical exploitation without deeper philosophical framework justifying such manipulation. However, when practitioners tap deeper principles, understanding gaps can be more eloquent than content filling them. Effects prove genuine. Your mind still becomes the engine driving narrative forward, supplying missing elements, transforming fragment into experience. Here, the quiet twist returns with full force. You are not merely observing this phenomenon, but actively participating in its continuation. Right now, your consciousness layers these fragments into a grand narrative about Lovecraft's unfinished tales, creating metastory with its own gaps, curiosities, tonal arcs. You will carry the bell tolling through fog from Azathoth, the forbidden drawer from the evil clergyman, the Latin murmur from the very old folk, into private mythology where they continue patient transformation work. The fragments have found new hosts, new theaters, new stages for performing eternal incompletion drama. The algorithm watches, learns, adapts, feeding fragments new spreading methods, new platforms to colonize, new minds to inhabit. The theater has no walls now, no boundaries between stage and audience. Everyone wears masks, and every mask reflects another screen's glow. Infinite recursion of fragments spawning fragments, gaps opening onto gaps, the unsaid speaking through spaces between words, scrolling endlessly through digital night. We have walked among masks and books, fog and bells, letters and edits, veils and voids. The stage smells of dust and old water, accumulated atmosphere of countless performances layered into walls. The audience sits in contemplative quiet, no longer restless strangers but co-conspirators in ritual that has changed everyone present. The curtain we opened at the beginning remains held at the same angle, but our eyes have transformed. We see different shapes in its folds now, recognize patterns invisible when we first entered this space. This is the circular echo, the return that deepens rather than repeats. In Chapter 1, we promised forbidden knowledge, that Lovecraft's lost stories are not lost, and that they do not end because they function best as engines with no off switch. We told you the cost. Complicity. We have paid it together. You have supplied endings that do not end. You have been the bow drawn across the instrument, sustaining a note no page can hold. The fragment acted on you. It may still be acting. Consider Azathoth. The bell you heard at dusk inside the fragment is also the bell we use to call you to this gathering. Bells signal. Beginnings and endings, weddings and deaths, school days and fires. Here the bell rings for a different thing, the awareness that some stories are designed to open you, not to close themselves. The book taught you that handling an object, even a digital one, writes a sign on your palm. You picked up this episode. You held it. The sign may be there now, faint as condensation on glass. The descendant taught you that inheritance flows through shelves as much as through blood. You are now an heir. The editorial hands passed the masks down. Derleth pulled strings and moved scenery for good and ill. Carter draped new cloth on old forms. Campbell painted fresh fog on English lanes. Scholars placed labels. All of this happened so that you could stand here and feel the two cults pull in your chest. The desire for an ending, the savor of a veil. You now know how that pull works. You can choose your ritual. The mechanism of the gap is no longer abstract. It lives in how you will finish this. Will you turn off the light and think of the moonlight on a marsh, the wrong grin approaching? Will you rank fragments and argue about which are real? Will you buy a cloth-bound reprint and press your nose to the paper? Will you write a story that stops where it should? The fragment has taken a shape in your life. The idea acts on you, and if it acts on you, it acts through you. Now the twist we seeded returns. The stories wanted you. Unfinishedness is not a defect, but an appetite. Fragments seek endings the way seeds seek soil. To listen like this is to offer yourself as ground. This is not a curse, it is a communion. You are the key and the gate. By hearing about Azathoth, you became its survivor and its servant. By imagining the book, you performed from it. By walking with the descendant, you joined a line. You are in the circle. The stage uses you to keep the play going. There is mercy in this complicity. It explains why the veil and the void do not cancel but complete, why the unsaid can feel like shelter after a day of answers. You can hold both. The scholar's patience and the dreamer's surrender, the need for maps and the joy of mist. Tonight, your posture is negative capability, standing in uncertainty, lamp low, eyes adjusting to the dark until shapes arrange themselves without demand. We will end softly, as we promised. The bell fades. The water is still. The stars do not change for us. Cosmic horror's mercy is its honesty. It tells us that the curtain will always move. In a draft we cannot map. That there are more masks than faces. That the page will sometimes stop because it must. That a good ending is sometimes no ending at all. And yet, before the lamps die, let a final widening occur. The bell of Azathoth leads to a larger theater, where principles wear names like masks and masks wear stars. Beyond these fragments wait languages we have not learned to hear, geometries we have not learned to bear, pantheons that are not families but forces. When next the curtain lifts, we will follow the line from page to principle, from object to cosmology, from whisper to wind. For now, close the window to a safer inch, keep the book on its shelf, and listen for the quiet work of unfinished tales continuing in you. Steady as tide, patient as stone, faithful as the dark that gathers when the stage is empty, waiting for the next sign, the next mask, the next bell to ring. A curtain call for the small players, those fragments that work in shadows while the famous titles hold center stage under the footlight's glare. Not every fragment wears a recognizable name or claims space in standard collections. Some live in notebook jotting scrawled during sleepless nights when the fog pressed against Providence windows, in paragraphs that never found proper titles, in poems that became prologues for prose works that never materialized beyond the planning stage. These minor masks form a constellation around the major fragments we have examined, smaller stars that make the bigger shape legible when the sky clears and the eye learns to trace patterns in darkness. Open the commonplace book and discover that it does not tell stories in any conventional sense. Instead, it lists temptations, catalogs seeds waiting for fertile soil, presents a menu of possibilities that reads like incantations whispered in empty rooms. Man hears strange drumming beneath house. Cellar earth has been recently disturbed. A mirror that shows an older room behind you than the one you stand in. A mask that refuses to be removed. A canal with black water that reflects stars that are not in this sky. Each entry functions as a trap set with precision, waiting patiently for a writer to spring it, to provide the flesh that would give these skeletal concepts their full horror. Some were indeed triggered, transforming into masterpieces, becoming the rats in the walls, the music of Eric Zahn, the outsider. Others never found their moment, remaining forever potential, their unsprung energy itself constituting a kind of fragment. These represent half-rituals, invitations extended to guests who never arrived, doors opened onto rooms that were never furnished, but somehow remain more compelling than completed spaces. Beyond the commonplace book lie letters where Lovecraft mused endlessly on stories he might write, projects that existed fully in his imagination but never made the journey to completed manuscript. He contemplated a comprehensive history of the Necronomicon, tracing its transmission through centuries of forbidden scholarship, a project he did partially complete but left tantalizingly incomplete. He envisioned a treatise on dreams as real terrains, territories as mappable and dangerous as any earthly geography, where the dreamlands would receive scientific cartography. He speculated about odd corners of Providence that could be made uncanny through careful attention to their historical layers, the way colonial foundations press through modern surfaces like bones through thin skin. Some of these musings crystallized into essays, most notably Supernatural Horror in Literature, a finished work about unfinishedness in others, a critical study that becomes itself a kind of fragment by pointing toward possibilities it never fully explores. Others emerged as poems, particularly Fungi from Yugoth, a sonnet cycle that feels like a series of painted doors arranged along an endless corridor. Each sonnet offers glimpses into rooms that are never fully entered, landscapes that remain forever peripheral. The lamp flared up and sheathed in sudden flame. I saw the thing but cannot tell its name. Marginalia reveals another layer of fragmentary creation, showing us Lovecraft's mind at work on other writers' texts, like a scholar preparing materials for rituals not yet conceived. He annotates books with exclamation marks that function like tiny torches, underlines passages that catch his attention, scribbles brief comments that serve as seeds for future work. In these margins, you can hear pre-stories forming. Use this timbre, he notes beside a particularly effective atmospheric passage. An excellent atmosphere, he observes, marking techniques for later deployment. The phrase, "on the rim of the world," possesses real power, he records, recognizing linguistic tools that might serve his own cosmic purposes. These marginalia represent footlights being placed around a stage that will later host performances we can only imagine. When you read those markings now, preserved through the dedicated work of editors and archivists, you participate in a ghostly collaboration, watching a master craftsman select materials for constructions that exist only in potential. The hand that annotated reaches across decades to touch your wrist on the page. The phenomenon extends to false fragments, attributions that do not withstand scholarly scrutiny, but continue circulating because they feel authentically Lovecraftian. Misremembered lines from actual works, juvenilia conflated with mature style, pieces like The Hoard of the Wizard Beast, sometimes misascribed through wishful thinking, casual passages from letters that achieve viral status as standalone quotes despite Lovecraft never having written them exactly that way. This apocrypha becomes part of the theatrical machinery, teaching both caution about textual authority and openness to the possibility that authenticity matters less than effect. These false fragments function as masks that produce real responses, demonstrating that the mechanism of incompletion operates independently of authorial intention. The seam becomes the ghost. The very uncertainty about provenance amplifies the uncanny effect. The constellation metaphor proves essential because it reframes loss as connection rather than absence. The lost stories are not isolated phenomena, floating in literary void, but lights in a vast network of creative potential. When you connect the small points, commonplace book entries with their cryptic suggestions, underlined phrases that caught a master's attention, individual lines from sonnet cycles that point toward larger territories, even the false attributions that feel truer than truth. You begin to trace a larger pattern in the sky. The shape that emerges resembles some vast animal constellation, a creature made of almosts and maybes, of beginnings that chose not to become endings. This network demonstrates that incompletion functions as method rather than accident in Lovecraft's work. The fragments do not represent failures to complete, but successful explorations of territories where completion would constitute betrayal of essential mystery. Each small piece, whether a commonplace entry that never sprouted, a marginal note that remained marginal, or a false attribution that generates authentic dread, contributes to an overall architecture of suggestion that proves more powerful than any single completed work could achieve. The minor fragments teach patience with incompletion, reverence for the unsprung trap, appreciation for margins as fertile territory rather than empty space. You can navigate this constellation like ancient mariners used stars, finding direction by connecting points of light across vast distances. The commonplace book provides one set of coordinates, the marginalia another, the false fragments a third. Together they map territories where your own fragments might take root, where your attention might discover gaps worth preserving rather than filling. This is the Milky Way of almosts, a galaxy of productive incompletion that continues expanding as each new reader adds their own points of light to the pattern. The archive itself becomes a stage where boxes open like trapdoors, tissue paper lifts with sighs, and inked signatures gleam like wet stones at low tide. So let the small lights guide you through the fog tonight. Keep a list of your own temptations. Keep a candle burning low. Touch the paper and feel how it holds more than ink. Hear the bell tolling in margins where other hands once wrote, where fragments gather, meaning condenses like moisture on glass. Follow the pattern, not any single path. The constellation knows you are watching, and it watches back with 1,000 patient eyes that never close, never complete their gaze, but hold you steady in the space between seeing and understanding, where the most profound mysteries choose to dwell. Take these with you, not rules, not dogma, instruments. Lay them out on a table under a low lamp where the light catches their edges like frost on window glass. Touch each one. Feel its weight in your palm. Understand how it balances between mystery and method. Then wrap them carefully and carry them as you go to the water's edge, to the quiet alley where lamps flicker at odd intervals, to the dusty bookshop with its smell of old leather and forgotten names, or simply outside to gaze at the indifferent stars that maintain their proper distance. First, the object and the void. Every effective fragment offers one tangible anchor, the distant bell from Azathoth, the damp book whose pages smell of opened crypts, the mask that refuses removal, cold water rising through cellar stones, and surrounds it with carefully arranged absence. Find your anchor and give it stage. Notice how your mind hums when it leans toward the edge, that recognition signal telling you whether you are being drawn or choosing to be drawn. In art, in life, in the subtle fears that flicker at consciousness's periphery, practice this balance. The object gives the void shape. The void gives the object power. Neither functions alone. Second, recognize the two cults within. Completion offers relief. The veil preserves awe. Do not sneer at either tendency, for both serve essential functions. Ask which your night requires. End the story you must end for psychological relief. Leave untouched the story that breathes better. Half told. When another completes a fragment you cherish, decide whether to read their version as a new mask or as an attempt to sew a mouth onto something that speaks more powerfully through silence. Your discernment is ritual. Practice it gently. Third, adopt negative capability as compass. Practice standing in uncertainty without irritation, without the desperate compulsion to hallucinate doors that are not there. This is not passivity but deliberate posture, allowing you to dwell in threshold spaces, the moment between waking and sleeping, the pause before decision, the white space after a tantalizing sentence. It lets the curtain move in unseen drafts without forcing you to pull it aside. Your mind will resist this, accustomed to narratives that conclude, but by holding steady you attune yourself to deeper rhythms where processes unfold without regard for human need for closure. Fourth, train the editor's eye. Learn to see seams not to scorn, but to savor them. The visible stitch in The Thing in the Moonlight is the ghost. The compression artifact in modern analog horror is the face attempting to form. When you notice a seam in your own narrative, an unclosed loop, a sentence that stops abruptly, a relationship that refuses easy categorization, test whether it should remain. Some doors are truer half open. Some words gain power by refusing the next word. The seam becomes window into possibility. Fifth, cultivate the commonplace habit. Keep a list, not of plots, but of traps. The window overlooking an alley where a lamp flickers irregularly, casting shadows that seem to move independently. The book bearing an owner's name in unrecognizable alphabet, its letters like tiny grasping hands. The canal that smells different at night, carrying scents of subterranean currents and forgotten histories. Write them the moment they brush your shoulder. This practice transforms you into conscious collaborator with fragments, training perception to identify raw material of dread. Sixth, remember the self as stage. You are not outside this phenomenon, but part of its continuation. The idea acts on you, and your memory becomes its theater. Your attention is lamp oil. Spend it wisely. Do not fear that fragments will colonize you. They already have. But you can choose the terms: channels of creativity, candles of contemplation, quiet company in darkness. Safe transgression is possible. You can explore these territories and return, changed but intact. Seventh, practice the circular echo. Return deliberately to beginnings. Read opening paragraphs again. Listen for bells at dusk, not as memory but as fresh sound. Walk near water and wait for ripples with no apparent cause. The return deepens the first image without collapsing it into familiarity. The circle marks ground where you stood when you first saw the veil move, measuring distance traveled and shifts in perception. Eighth, learn star indifference. Remember that cosmic horror's core is not the monster but the structure, indifference, scale, time. Internalize this and you will not mistake lore for truth. Names are masks, structures are faces. When you feel small, let the feeling be accurate rather than annihilating. Relief comes from honest measurement of your size against eternity's backdrop. The universe operates according to principles that predate consciousness and will continue after our species dissolves. This is not cruelty but fact, and accepting it paradoxically provides comfort. Ninth, become a door for others. If you make things, videos, stories, songs, practice the fragment with care. Offer object and void. Trust your audience to act, to lean forward, to supply missing pieces from their own depths. Do not fear being called incomplete. In this mode, incompletion may be the most complete gesture available, honest reflection of a universe that never bows to our desire for curtains to close. 10th, light the candle. Literally, bring flame the next time you read, or arrange dim lamplight that keeps the room in twilight. Create a stage for yourself. Let pages end in white and resist the urge to flee into another feed. Sit with the unsaid. It will speak through implications, through subtle shifts of shadow, through your mind's hum as it leans into void. We have reached an ending that refuses to behave like ending. You can put these instruments away or tape them inside your coat, where lining is smooth and secret. The fog is thick, but you have learned to enjoy being damp. It proves you are close to waterlines where stories breathe. The water is cold, but you read temperature as information, not warning. The stars maintain appropriate distance, steadying rather than isolating. Walk softly tonight. Hold breath when curtains move. Let stages be empty if they must, treating emptiness as partner. The page turns by itself, and you are ready. The curtain we opened is still open, because the curtain is not a thing that opens or closes. It is a motion, a perpetual flutter you can glimpse in the corner of any room if you turn your head quickly enough to catch the draft that comes from territories unmapped. Masks wait on shelves that extend beyond sight. Stages wait in theaters with no walls. Audiences wait in chairs that face directions not yet invented. We will meet again in a different arrangement of these same pieces, the fragments reshuffled like cards in a deck that never runs out of suits. We have mapped the territories of incompletion, but territories have neighbors, and beyond the borders we have traced lie regions that beckon with their own mysteries. Beyond the fragments lie the completed works that bear their influence like genetic markers, and beyond those stretch the deeper cosmological structures that Lovecraft glimpsed but never fully articulated. The lost stories are not isolated islands floating in literary void, but archipelagos, connected by submerged chains of meaning that surface in unexpected places, creating navigation hazards for those who sail these waters without proper charts. Consider the languages that were never fully developed, linguistic systems that exist in fragments scattered throughout the mythos, like archaeological shards waiting for patient reconstruction. The Ar-Liahian tongue appears in ceremonial fragments throughout Lovecraft's work, but its grammar remains spectral, its vocabulary tantalizingly incomplete. Fanglui magl wunaf Cthulhu relia wagahnagal ftagan. We know what this means, but we do not know how it means. What grammatical principles govern its construction? What other thoughts might be expressible in this alien syntax? The elder things possessed their own script, carved into Antarctic stone with symbols that suggest mathematical precision wed to aesthetic sensibilities utterly foreign to human understanding. The deep ones sang in harmonies that human throats cannot reproduce, their underwater ceremonies conducted in frequencies that carry meanings our air-breathing consciousness cannot decode. These linguistic fragments point toward entire cultures, complete modes of consciousness that exist in the spaces between published works, waiting for explorers willing to learn languages that might teach them to think thoughts impossible in human tongues. Consider also the mathematics of forbidden angles, the non-Euclidean geometries that appear as architectural details throughout his stories but never as complete systems worthy of their own treatises. What would a full exploration of impossible mathematics look like? How would it feel to learn to think in dimensions that have no names, to calculate using principles that predate human logic? The fragments suggest that Lovecraft glimpsed calculation methods developed by civilizations that existed before human mathematics, before the axioms we take for granted had crystallized into forms we consider natural. These mathematical fragments whisper of theorems that could reshape reality, of proofs that would demonstrate the provisional nature of physical laws we assume permanent. Perhaps déjà vu is an editorial mark bleeding through the paper where such equations were once written. The dreamlands extend far beyond their mapped territories. We explored some unseen shores in our case studies, but what of the unmapped depths that lie beneath even the deepest dream geography? The published Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath reveals only the surface of a reality that might extend through infinite strata of consciousness, each layer operating according to principles more alien than the last. What dreams do the gods themselves dream when they sleep in cities beneath the waves? What nightmares haunt the nightmares that haunt us, creating recursive loops of terror that spiral down through levels of reality we cannot imagine? And then there are the entities that were never named, the forces that operate behind even the great old ones, like stagehands behind more visible performers. The fragments hint at hierarchies beyond hierarchy, at cosmic principles so fundamental that even Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth serve merely as their local manifestations, regional managers in a company whose true scope remains hidden. These are the powers that write the laws of physics as rough drafts, that compose reality as an experimental poem they might abandon at any moment if their attention shifts to more interesting projects. They are the authors of authors, the dreamers of dreamers, the silence that gives meaning to all sounds. The modern echoes we traced remain fragmentary, constantly evolving. Digital horror continues to push boundaries, discovering novel methods to create dread from corrupted files and glitching signals. Virtual reality offers stages for impossible architectures, where players can walk through non-Euclidean spaces, experiencing firsthand the disorientation Lovecraft could only describe. Artificial intelligence begins generating its own fragments, producing texts that seem to remember stories that were never written, creating new forms of haunting that emerge from machine learning rather than human imagination. The future of cosmic horror may lie not solely in human creativity, but in algorithmic dreaming, in systems that learn to fear what they cannot process, and communicate that fear through outputs that feel more authentic than intended. But perhaps the deepest territory remains the one we have been walking through together, the reader's mind as landscape shaped by encounter with the incomplete. How do these fragments change the way we perceive reality? How do they alter our relationship with uncertainty, with the spaces between knowledge and ignorance? The true mythos may not consist of the collection of stories and entities, but rather the transformation of consciousness that occurs in those who engage with them deeply enough to let the fragments do their patient work of restructuring attention itself. You carry the seeds now, in your memory of bells tolling through fog, of water dripping in stone corridors, of masks that refuse to reveal what lies behind their eye holes, of the moment when you realized that you were not just observing but participating in phenomena that operate according to principles older than observation itself. These seeds will grow in the darkness behind your eyes, in the quiet moments when you notice gaps in the world around you, spaces where meaning should be but isn't quite there yet, where reality seems to thin like paper held too close to flame. The next revelation waits in those spaces. It might emerge as we explore the linguistic archaeology of alien tongues, attempting to reconstruct grammatical systems from ceremonial fragments. It might surface in an investigation of the architectural impossibilities that Lovecraft sketched but never built, blueprints for structures that exist only in dimensions we cannot enter. It might manifest in deeper exploration of the dreamland's unmapped regions, or in analysis of how digital consciousness encounters cosmic horror and generates new forms of fragment. The territory is vast, and we have only begun to map its edges. For now, put your hand on the page's white margin one more time. Feel how cool it is, how it seems to extend beyond the boundaries of screen or paper into territories that have no names. That coolness is the touch of infinite possibility, the sensation of standing at the edge of regions that have not yet been explored but are already calling to those who know how to listen to the spaces between words, who can hear the silence that gives meaning to sound. The fragments continue their patient work, spreading through every mind that encounters them, seeding new incompletions, new gaps for future explorers to discover. They are not endings but beginnings, not conclusions but invitations to continue the work of exploration in territories where maps are written in disappearing ink and compasses point toward questions that have not yet learned to ask themselves. The bell tolls in the distance. The water drips in stone corridors. The candle flame leans toward a draft you cannot map, and you lean forward, despite knowing better, to hear what the silence has to say.